Hello everyone, welcome back to Too Cool for Middle School. My name is Megan and today we're going to talk about 5 books that I really loved as an English teacher and that I would recommend to other English teachers. Ooh, this is good. This is gingerbread spice tea. It's finally cold enough to bring in some of the fall flavors. I'm not a big fan of pumpkin, but I like this gingerbread tea. So I just wanted to talk about 5 books that have inspired me as an English teacher. They're less on like the technical side, like the mechanics of teaching kids to read or write. And if you have any recommendations for those types of books, please leave them down below. That is like an area of weakness for me. It's something that I probably should read up on more. I just kind of rely on our textbook and curriculum. I feel like it does a pretty good job. So let's finally, sorry this intro is so long, let me get into these 5 books that I would recommend to anyone who teaches English. I'll start with the first one that I read, and I don't have it in my library. I couldn't find it. I think it's in my library at school because it was a book that I referred to a lot. And this one is The Book Whisperer by Donalyn Miller. It's a pretty popular book for English teachers to read. I remember, I read this like 7 years ago. It was before I was at the school I'm currently at. I was at my previous school, and our principal had read this book over the summer, and then she bought us copies during, kind of like that first staff meeting back to school in August, and I read it and I really liked it. I learned a lot and I was inspired, even though I wasn't able to like replicate exactly what Donalyn Miller did. So she is a pretty famous teacher. She's won a lot of awards and written books about getting kids to read. And I think she teaches like upper elementary, but I think I was teaching 6th grade English at the time, maybe 8th grade English. Right now I'm teaching 7th grade English. So I bounce around a little bit between 6th, 7th, and 8th. And there is a pretty big difference between like how you inspire and motivate 6th graders to read versus 8th graders and the type of books that you have on your shelves and stuff like that. So, but I think her examples were mostly about 6th grade readers, and she did have far fewer students than I have. She only had like either 30 or maybe like 60, maybe like 2 groups, and she had them for a long time throughout the day. And so she provides time for them to do silent reading, and she has meetings with each kid where she checks in with them and talks to them about what they've been reading and what they might like to read next, and ways that they could challenge themselves or books that they would enjoy. And she's really intentional about getting to know each student as a reader. She also reads a lot herself, and so she just is that example to her kids of somebody who reads a lot and really enjoys reading. She has a ton of books in her classroom, so this is what inspired me to not only utilize the school library and the community library, but also have a pretty decent collection of books within my classroom, which it's taken me 11 years to amass, but I have quite a few. I mean, if a kid doesn't have a book when we're doing some reading, they can go find something that will interest them. I've got something for you. So there's never an excuse to just like not have a book. So anyway, her students read like at minimum 40 books a year. And when you first start reading it, you're like, that's impossible. There's no way. Like most of my students don't even read a single book in a year, not even the whole class novel that we all read. But she does give you a lot of tips and strategies and ways to help your kids learn to love reading and become readers. So my students, I actually require them to read 20 books in a year. So we do 10 per semester. I don't have nearly as much in-class time to give them to dedicate to reading, so I don't require as many books, but they can usually hit that 10 books per semester mark. I was really scared to push this assignment out the first time I did it, but a lot of them reached that 10 book mark and then even went over. And then in the next semester, we start again, try to get 10 more. I do it along with them. And then I have kind of a different way of recording the books that they read, different from reading logs, and it's more based on what motivates me to read. And that's social media and just sharing the cover of the book I read and little tidbits about it and being inspired by my peers and the things that they have read. So I try to incorporate a lot of that into my classroom and into the classroom culture and just help my students to become readers. So this book was the one that inspired me to do that. So I would recommend it to you if you want to learn more about how to get your kids to read. And I'll link down below, all of the books, and then also any materials that I've created that were inspired by these books. The next book that I would recommend is called Cultivating Genius, an Equity Framework for Culturally and Historically Responsive Literacy by Gholdy Muhammad. Now, this book is applicable to basically every subject area, but it is focused on literacy. So I think it's most helpful to English teachers. You can pretty much apply like anything from this book. If you teach something else, she also, provides you with strategies and ideas for like incorporating more literacy into those other subject areas. But again, it's mostly focused on literacy. So the research inspiration for this book came from Black literary societies of the early 20th century. So during Reconstruction, after slavery had ended, when for so many years Black people had not been allowed to learn to read or write, there were these societies that came together to do just that, to read and read about new ideas and like what was happening in the world, and then to write in these like newspapers and journals and put their ideas out there, and then they would come together and meet and they would discuss and they would debate and talk. So these are all of the features of literacy: listening and speaking and writing and reading and researching and creatively developing your own ideas. And it was born out of rebellion in some sense, and understanding that the reason that they had not been allowed to learn to read and write for so many centuries was because they would be too powerful if they could share ideas and communicate and read and write. And that's something that you want to be able to inspire your students with. Like, you are so much more powerful, you are so much more effective if you are a good communicator, if you know how to take in information, if you are reading and listening to podcasts or information, and if you are putting out your own ideas and discussing topics of the day with your peers and learning from other people in your community. Like, you're unstoppable. And so that's the inspiration behind this book. And it has so many practical ideas within it. And I love it. I've read it a couple of times. I read it on my own. I've read it for a book club. I actually have like book club materials that you can use with this if you want to read it like with other teachers. It's really powerful, and it just reinvigorates you to spend that time teaching your kids to read and write and think and speak and listen and debate, because if they can do that, there's nothing that they can't do. So I highly, highly recommend this one. And then if you can also find any like videos of Gholdy Muhammad speaking, or if you like attend any conferences where she's speaking, also go see her because she's great. The third book that I would recommend to any English teacher is Keeping the Wonder, An Educator's Guide to Magical, Engaging, and Joyful Learning by Jenna Copper, Ashley Bible, Abby Gross, and Stacey Lamb. As a disclaimer, I do know all four of these authors, and they are all amazing teachers. So this book came out of their creativity as teachers and the ways that they not only inspired students within their classes, but they were also sharing those ideas on Instagram and in their blogs, and then inspiring other teachers to do the same types of things in their classrooms. And so they have professional developments that you can go to, and then they put all of their ideas together in a book. At the time of writing this book, all of these teachers taught high school, and it can be difficult with, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds to get them excited about this new short story that you guys are going to read today, or, writing an essay in response to something. And so they shared their best ideas for hooking their students, getting them excited about reading again. I have a first grader, and I know that, like in those elementary school classrooms, sometimes all a teacher has to do is just like pull out a book that has an interesting cover, and they're so excited to like sit on the floor and just listen to this story. And somewhere along the line, kids lose that wonder for like books and creativity and writing stories. So the idea in this book is to find ways to get that back, to keep that wonder in like middle school and high school classrooms. So it's really, really useful for that. You'll just find tons of ideas that you can apply to really any English lesson. There are also a bunch of guest authors like sprinkled throughout the chapters who, some of them teach English and then some of them teach other subject areas and other grade levels. And so really, no matter what you teach, like grade level wise or subject area wise, you can find something useful in this book. But particularly for English teachers, you'll just find so many good examples and ideas and just little things that you can do. It doesn't have to be like full-on room transformations or anything where you have to spend a lot of money. It's just kind of simple, creative ways that you can add that wonder to your classroom by just like pausing for a second and just like thinking of one or two things that you could do for the lesson the next day that are going to pique your students' interest. So I really love this one. If you're feeling kind of burnt out about teaching, this one will reinvigorate you. The last two books I'm going to share with you are a little bit different, and I'm sharing them with you especially because you are also like English nerds like me, I'm assuming, and people who like to get into like the nitty-gritty and the theory of it all. So I read this book a while back. It's called Was the Cat in the Hat Black? The Hidden Racism of Children's Literature and the Need for Diverse Books by Philip Nell. When did this book come out? 2017. Okay. I tab my books. I know you shouldn't do that, but these are mine and I'll do whatever I want with them. And this is how I go back and find cool quotes. So this book is a series of essays that are all just amazingly well done, well researched, well written. And so one of them is The Strange Career of the Cat in the Hat, or Dr. Seuss's Racial Imagination. And then there are others. How to Read Uncomfortably, Racism, Affect, and Classic Children's Books. I so highly recommend that chapter. Like if you are a professor teaching future English teachers, or even like future elementary teachers, this chapter alone is also very good. Whiteness, Nostalgia, and Fantastic Flying Books, William Joyce's Racial Erasures versus Hurricane Katrina. Don't Judge a Book by Its Color, The Destructive Fantasy of Whitewashing and Vice Versa. And Childhood's Outside the Boundaries of Imagination, Genre is the New Jim Crow. And the conclusion is A Manifesto for Anti-Racist Children's Literature. This is just such a good book to kind of like peel back the layers a little bit and look at the books that we were probably read as we were growing up and some of the books that we were like required to read when we were growing up and just those subtle messages that we received. And I feel like especially with teachers, if there was like some book that like really, you know, connected with us or like helped us learn something, we want to share that with our students. And if teachers are presented with information that they don't really want to hear about an author, about a book, and how, you know, there could be something problematic in there, they have a really, really hard time hearing that and like changing what they do. Because, you know, these books inspired so much of what we do, and it's just really, you know, that can be hard. So it's about so much more than The Cat in the Hat, who was, you know, based on like minstrel characters. And Seuss has been a topic of like, I was gonna say debate, but it's not even real debate when it's just like a bunch of Facebook comments or like tweets. But I would recommend just skipping all that and jumping into this book, reading it all the way through, or just like reading like a chapter here and there, because they are like, they can stand alone. You could just read a chapter and just kind of like mull that over for a while. It would be a really good like teacher book club book. It's just so excellent, so well done. So I highly, highly recommend this. And if you do read it, please like message me or leave a comment or something. Like let me know what stood out to you, what you thought about it, because I haven't seen too many other people reading this book, but it's one of my favorites. The final book recommendation that I have for you is this one, The Dark Fantastic, Race and the Imagination, From Harry Potter to the Hunger Games by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. It's kind of along the same lines as the last book, because it is, again, like several essays put together to create this book. And again, it's all about theory. So this one is like the theory of fantasy and our imaginations. And that's kind of the common theme between these two books, is that like literature and reading and characters especially when they're pretend, like demonstrate to us what we can imagine. And so one of the things that Ebony Elizabeth Thomas says in this book is that when she was growing up, she saw Black characters like herself only in the past. So you would read something like Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which is an amazing book, but that's about Black people in the past. And, you know, it's not a happy book. It's all about struggle during Reconstruction, or like To Kill a Mockingbird. So generally, these Black characters are presented to us in the past. And she was someone who loves to read fantasy, as so many of our students do. I find that like that's the most popular genre for the kids in my class who are really avid readers. They just go through, you know, fantasy series like so quickly. And so she loved fantasy, and she was like, why don't I see myself in the future or in these like imagined worlds? Like, why are there so few Black characters in these beloved fantasy series? So she's questioning that a lot, and then just like looking at like the limits of our imagination. Like, if we can imagine elves that speak and, you know, these entire fantastical worlds, but people are like, but not a Black character, that's too much, we can't imagine that in this series. Then what in the world has happened to our imaginations? Like, even in fantasy, our racism transcends. And I haven't been following like I guess there's like that Lord of the Rings reboot or whatever, and it does have some Black characters. And just as she says in this book, like she could have predicted this, people are losing their minds over a fake history. Like, you know, supposedly Lord of the Rings has this whole history to it, but it's pretend, it's made up. And there were Black people in all of those historical contexts that we are seeing, like the flip side fantasy version of. So their history is wrong, and even their imaginations are racist. So it's just bizarre to see. And then she also writes a little bit about like fan fiction in this book and her experience. I mean, I guess this was like 10 years ago when there were more like chat rooms and just like forums for fan fiction where like more people spent time. I don't know if kids today are spending all that much time on like Wattpad or whatever. Like I've asked my students now about this, and a few of them do, but I don't know how popular it is anymore. But as a writer, Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, you know, found herself there. You know, all of us loved Harry Potter, and J.K. Rowling is definitely problematic at this point. You know, it's hard. It's hard to ask English teachers and readers to like don't take my Harry Potter from me. Like, that was so special. You know, these characters and these worlds and these stories do become a part of us. That's why it is really hard to like question these foundational texts, you know, that just like meant so much to us. So anyway, she was like somebody who would write like fan fiction of Harry Potter, and she would like include Black characters in her stories. So she talks a little bit about that. And so I was inspired by this book to incorporate fantasy into my classroom and use it in an academic way, and not just as like the reward. Like, you get to read fantasy after you read this like historical fiction novel or something, but like I'm gonna force you to read. Like, no, let's like study fantasy. It in itself is legitimate. So we do these fantasy lit circles, and also like one piece of that journey through the fantasy books that we read is like checking out social media or online forums or like fan fiction sites to see like what are people doing with these stories. Have people like taken them into themselves and like started to write their own fan fiction? Have they done fan art, like created you know, the version of the characters that they see? Have they put that on like Tumblr or whatever? Are kids still using Tumblr? I don't know. Or putting it on Instagram or whatever. Like, book talk is the new thing now. And so, you know, is anyone talking about this book on Book Talk? So, you know, sometimes authors write these stories and build these worlds, and then millions of fans and readers like take those stories and just create all new things with them. And it's a place to like find community and like find other people who like what you like, and then also put your own spin on it. So I wasn't much of a fantasy reader before I read this book, and then it got me more into fantasy. So again, I just highly recommend this one as well. I'm gonna give you a quick bonus. Like, maybe you aren't able to sit down and read a whole book right now. Maybe you're in school and you have a bunch of like required reading. You don't have time to read. This podcast episode I thought was so good. You can just sit and listen to this while you're driving or cleaning or whatever. You'll have it done in less than an hour. It's an episode of The Argument with Jane Coaston, I think is the host, called What Should High Schoolers Read? And she interviews Caitlin Greenidge, who wrote Liberty, which is a book that I really liked. I have it reviewed on my channel somewhere. And then Esau Macaulay, who I follow him a lot on Twitter and Instagram and social media and stuff. So I wanted to hear what they had to say about what we should read in high school in particular. And both of them had taught high school English at some point, and they're both now writers. And it's just such an interesting conversation because like the canon, whatever we consider the canon and whatever is like required reading in high school is kind of this like cultural touch point for everybody. So if everyone read like The Great Gatsby or Catcher in the Rye or something like that in high school, then, you know, like whether you went to college or not, like whatever job you went into, wherever you live, we could have a conversation and like use that reference. And something about that is powerful. So, you know, should we be throwing out the canon entirely if there are problems with it, which there are, but does that mean that we should, in this particularly like divided time when people are just like receiving entirely different information about the world, like depending on like the sources where you get like your news and your entertainment and stuff, we don't even have like a newspaper that comes to our house anymore where everyone is at least like just reading the stories in the local newspaper. We have like one thing that connects us. People aren't watching like the nightly news. There's so little that is a common experience for like all Americans. So, you know, they argue that throwing that out without thinking really deeply about it is probably not a good thing. And then Esau Macaulay also talks about how like, but you know, your regionality, if you come from the South or you come from the West or you come from the Northeast, like maybe there should also be books that are like required reading that kind of tether you to that place and that culture, because the United States it's so huge and there are so many different cultures within the United States. And then how do we make sure that, you know, what we're requiring students to read in high school or middle school or whenever also reflects all of the different types of people who live in the United States and not just like old dead white men? It's a really daunting task, but even those texts by old dead white men can actually show us so much more than we use them to do sometimes. So they have this really interesting conversation about like The Great Gatsby and even like Jane Austen and like the context around like when they are writing and like what their characters are going through like is influenced by slavery and colonialism and fear of replacement and stuff like that. So the conversation is just so good. Listen to it once, listen to it twice. And if you find any other just like excellent conversations like this, please also leave those recommendations in the comments below. I love finding stuff like this. This one just like rose to the top for me. This conversation was so good. And I think these books are so good. And I think they will make us better English teachers. And again, you'll notice that I don't really spend a lot of time, you know, nerding out on like the mechanics and grammar and stuff like that. I'm more into just like being inspired by how literacy is going to help us change the world and help our students change the world. And I want to read a book that's going to just excite me and inspire me to step into my classroom and use literature and texts to improve my students' lives and improve their opportunities, and, you know, hopefully they become better people as a result of what they read and write and listen to. So this is why I like teaching. This is why I like reading. This is why I like, you know, continuing to learn more about what we do as teachers. And I'm clearly losing my voice. My tea gave it a good effort, but this gingerbread can only do so much. All right, thank you guys so much for being here. I will see you in my next video. Bye.